that police made a sudden breakthrough in a murder case turned cold for nearly 30 years. Investigators say new advances in forensic technology combined with relentless police work helped to make this arrest all the way in Illinois.
On the evening of February 19, 1997, a 40-year-old woman in Southfield, Michigan was stabbed to death in her own home. Nobody had forced the locks, broken a window, or pried the door. She had let her killer inside and fought him hard before she died. The struggle had moved her from one room to another and left blood on the walls. One of her credit cards lay on the bedroom floor, dropped during the fight. The fingerprint on it wasn't hers. In 1997, no lab could pull a clean enough ridge pattern from that partial print, and no machine could read the small amount of DNA she had scratched from her attacker's skin into her own nails. Both items went into the evidence locker exactly as they were collected. The man whose mark she carried walked free for 29 years. Her name was Deborah Kennedy. She was 40 years old and lived alone in a single-story house on Lee Baker Drive in a Detroit suburb in Oakland County. She worked at the General Motors Technical Center in Warren, doing engineering work for the country's largest automaker, and she had been there long enough that her co-workers knew her routine by heart. Southfield in the 1990s was a middle-class suburb built out of farmland north of Detroit in the decades after the Second World War. By the time Deborah was killed, it was a city of office parks and quiet residential streets lined with brick ranch homes and small split levels. Lee Baker Drive was one of those streets. The houses sat close together, separated by driveways and short front yards. Neighbors knew each other by sight. People recognized which cars belonged on the block and which didn't. That February evening, Deborah was inside her house when someone came to the door. She let him in. What happened next was not quick. The medical examiner recorded multiple stab wounds as the cause of death. The scene told investigators what had happened in between. Furniture had been displaced and blood spatter marked the walls near her body. Deborah had not gone quietly. She had fought her attacker with everything she had, and her hands carried the defensive wounds to prove it. Under her fingernails, embedded in the soft tissue, was the skin of the man who killed her. After the killing, he wiped down the surfaces he had touched, took the weapon with him, and pulled the door shut behind him on the way out. The next morning, Deborah did not arrive at the GM Technical Center. A co-worker tried to reach her by phone. No answer. The co-worker called the Southfield Police Department and asked them to send someone out to Lee Baker Drive. Officers arrived at the house, found the front door undamaged, and went inside. Deborah was dead in her own home. The Southfield Police Department processed the scene that day. Detectives documented the wounds, the position of the body, the blood, and the condition of every room. They photographed the house, cataloged the contents, and collected anything that might matter. Two items mattered more than everything else they collected. The first was the credit card itself. It had been handled by someone other than Deborah, and the partial latent on its plastic surface did not belong to anyone in the household. Its ridges were faint, smudged from a single contact, but they were there. The second was the scrapings from beneath Deborah's nails. Both items went into sealed containers in evidence storage. Detectives canvassed Lee Baker Drive and the streets around it. They asked about unfamiliar cars parked on the cul-de-sac, strangers walking through the neighborhood, anything unusual during the hours Deborah was alone. Nobody had seen anything that helped narrow the search. Investigators interviewed co-workers from the GM Technical Center, friends and family. They built a list and went through it name by name, asking about deliveries, service people, and anyone with a reason to be inside the house or in front of it. People were cleared one by one. Nobody on that list explained the partial print on the credit card or the skin under her nails. Officers ran the latent through the automated fingerprint identification system the state of Michigan was using in 1997. It came back without a hit. They sent the genetic material to the lab for the limited DNA testing available at the time, and the sample was too small and too degraded for the methods of that era to do anything useful with it. The two strongest pieces of physical evidence from the scene each pointed at the same person, someone who had been inside that house and handled her property. Neither item could put a name to him. Detectives never recovered a weapon. The blade that stabbed Deborah went out the front door with the killer. The lack of forced entry, the missing weapon, and the partial print on a credit card that wasn't hers told detectives this had not been a random break-in. Somebody Deborah trusted had walked in, killed her, and walked back out with the knife. The 1997 investigators chased that theory and could not find their man. The case stayed active for months, then years. Tips came in and led nowhere. Detectives moved on to other cases and came back to the Kennedy file when something fresh surfaced. Nothing ever did. The two items pulled out of that house in 1997 stayed in the evidence locker, intact and unmatched. Forensic science advanced through the late 1990s and into the next 2 decades. Genetic testing grew more sensitive and could work with samples a fraction of the size labs had needed in 1997. Fingerprint analysis improved too. New software could now enhance partial latents that earlier systems had rejected as unreadable. National databases expanded with every booking in the country, and the FBI's combined DNA index system grew alongside them. Each generation of cold case investigator looked at the Kennedy file and wondered whether the material in storage was finally enough. For nearly 3 decades, the answer was no. The 1997 labs had tested the samples and gotten nothing. Without a fresh lead or a new candidate to compare them against, nobody had a reason to spend the money and the lab time on a resubmission that might come back the same way it had the first time. The Southfield Police Department did not forget the case. Officers handed it off from one investigator to the next as they retired or moved on, and every person who inherited the file reached the same conclusion. The answer was in the material from the scene, and the file was not going to move without something new to compare it against. Deborah's family lived with the weight of an unsolved killing. Her first cousin, a man named Reggie Daniel, refused to let the case become a folder that sat in a box and was never opened again. He called the department, and he kept calling. Each call put the same questions to them about the file and the material. The answer, year after year, was the same: nothing yet. In his own words, the trauma kept nagging at him. Deborah didn't deserve what came her way, he said, and the fact that nobody had ever been apprehended sat with him through every one of those years. He was the reason the file did not vanish. The family had been waiting for somebody to call back with news. For most of those years, no call came. The man who had killed Deborah left Michigan within 2 months of the murder. He went first to Arizona, more than 1,000 miles from Oakland County, then drifted through other addresses in Michigan, Oak Park and Highland Park, before settling in a small community in Illinois called Royal Lakes. The town had about 300 people. He drove and worked and ran errands like anybody else there. Nobody around him had any reason to ask about Michigan. Along the way, he picked up other arrests, more than once. When the Southfield chief later announced the arrest, he said the man was not a stranger to breaking into homes or to assaultive crimes. Each booking put his prints into the federal identification system. At some point, his DNI went into CODIS. His data sat in those federal systems alongside the records of tens of thousands of other people. The connection between his records and the evidence on Lee Baker Drive existed in theory from the moment his profile entered the database. But nobody had resubmitted the Kennedy samples for a comparison. The credit card sat in its envelope, the fingernail clippings sat in their container, and the man who had stabbed Deborah lived free in another state, his name in a database nobody had checked against a case nobody had reopened. By 2023, Reggie Daniel had walked into the Southfield Police Department in person and asked them to look at his cousin's case one more time. Phone calls had not been working, and he wanted to see somebody face to face. Chief Barron has said that conversation was part of why the file came back into circulation. In June of 2024, a Southfield detective named Brian Weeks went to the police administration with a request. He wanted permission to start working cold cases. Advances in genetic analysis and latent print processing had reached the point, in his view, where old material that had produced nothing in the 1990s might now yield results. He asked Chief Elvin Barron for authorization to pull old files and identify the ones where the science had a realistic chance of producing a match. Barron approved the request and gave Weeks the room to choose his own cases. Weeks pulled the Kennedy file out of the archive. He read through the original reports from 1997, the crime scene documentation, the interviews, the canvas results, the lab notes that came back negative. He studied the evidence log and saw the two items that had never been matched to anyone. The investigators who worked the case originally had done everything right. They had collected the material at the scene. They had submitted it for the testing that existed in 1997. The science of their era could not do what needed to be done. 27 years had passed since anyone had touched those items in a lab. The instruments had changed, and the databases had grown. And the person who left that material might have been booked for something else in the decades since, putting his prints and his genetic profile in systems that did not exist when Deborah was killed. By 2024, the odds of finding a match had changed. Weeks did not work the case alone. The detectives who had handled the original investigation in 1997 came back from retirement to consult. They had built the file when they were younger, and they wanted to see what the new methods would produce on the work they had done. The case had been theirs first, and they had carried it through their careers. Weeks resubmitted both items. The print went first. The fingerprint from the credit card went through modern identification systems. The enhancement software cleaned up what was on the plastic, sharpened the ridge detail, and ran the result against the National Fingerprint Database. In January of 2025, the comparison came back to a name. Weeks pulled the file on the man whose name had appeared, a man who had been in the system for years. He had been arrested multiple times, both before and after 1997, and his prints had been collected during those bookings and stored in the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System. For 28 years, his record and the latent from Deborah's credit card had both been sitting in law enforcement systems without ever being checked against each other. The 2025 comparison made the match in minutes. Weeks did not move to charge anyone on a fingerprint alone. He sent the fingernail clippings to the lab for genetic extraction, using methods that could work with smaller and more degraded samples than the technology available in 1997. The result took 8 months. In September of that same year, the DNA from under Deborah's nails matched a profile already in CODIS. The match came up automatically once the genetic profile was uploaded. It belonged to the same man whose fingerprint was on the credit card. Weeks had his second confirmation on the same suspect. The suspect's DNA was already in CODIS years before Weeks pulled the Kennedy file. The federal index would have flagged the match the day the profile was uploaded if anyone had given it a comparison sample from the scene. But the sample under Deborah's nails had never been sent for that check. Resubmitting old samples is not automatic. A detective has to flag the case, a chief has to approve the lab time, and a forensic crew has to take the work in hand. None of that happened to the Kennedy material until Weeks. The file had lived in storage among many others that had also gone cold and stayed there. The print nobody could read in 1997 and the DNA nobody could match tracked back to the same man. Weeks brought both forensic results to Chief Barron. Barron reviewed the findings, signed off on them, and authorized the warrant. The Southfield Police Department had a name to pursue for the first time. The investigation had moved from cold to active. His name was Robert Joseph Covington. He had been 29 years old in February of 1997. He had lived in a house directly across the street from Deborah Kennedy on Lee Baker Drive with his wife and mother-in-law. Both of those women have since died. Covington was not a stranger who had wandered through the neighborhood. From his driveway, he could see Deborah's front door. On that February evening, he crossed the street, came to her door, and went inside. Police announced 2 working theories of how he got in. The first was that Covington knew Deborah's schedule well enough to walk into the house while she was out, then waited for her to return and attacked her when she did. In the second, Deborah was friends with Covington's mother-in-law and trusted her neighbor enough to open the door when he knocked, at which point he forced his way past her. According to the chief, the actual motive will probably never be known. Before any investigator had a reason to ask Covington a single question, he was gone. His name never came up on the original suspect list. The detectives had asked about cars that didn't belong on the block. Covington's car did, while the partial print on the credit card sat in evidence storage with nowhere to go. The man who had left it on the plastic was 1,000 miles away. By March of 2026, more than a year after the first forensic match, Covington was 58 years old, and he had been living in Royal Lakes for years. Deputies from the Macoupin County Sheriff's Office and the Illinois State Police arrested him there on March 29, 2026, acting on a warrant out of Oakland County, Michigan. They pulled him over during a traffic stop and took him into custody. The stop had been planned and coordinated with the Southfield Police Department over several weeks. Body camera footage from the arrest later showed the moment they told him why he was being detained. The officers explained the warrant in detail and walked him through what it was for. When officers asked him why his DNA had been found in Deborah Kennedy's home, he went silent. Covington was extradited to Michigan on April 8th and arraigned the next day in Oakland County on charges of felony murder and open murder. He was denied bond and held in custody to await trial. On April 14, 2026, the Southfield Police Department held a press conference at the station. Chief Elvin Barron stood at the podium with Detective Brian Weeks beside him. In the room sat Reggie Daniel, Deborah's cousin, the same man who had called the department year after year, asking them not to let the case fade. Before the cameras turned on that morning, somebody from Southfield had called Daniel with the news that a name had come back and that the man had been arrested in Illinois. He had spent decades asking the question. He was hearing the answer over the phone, alone, before the room ever heard it. The name they gave him was one he had never heard before. The man who killed his cousin had been a stranger to the family across all those decades. Speaking for the family, Daniel told the room Deborah was a sweetheart. She was a darling, he said. He told reporters that no one in the family had been able to return to the house since the killing, and he thanked Southfield for hearing their plea and pursuing the case the way they had. "We were at one point thinking we would never see this day," he said. Daniel had gotten to know Brian Weeks during the investigation, and he described what he had made of him. "Detective Weeks, when we met, he was like a bulldog," Daniel said. "He just would not give up." Barron credited Weeks and the advances in forensic technology. "It's proof that even after decades, evidence can still speak and the truth can still be uncovered," the chief said. Weeks spoke briefly about what the case meant to him. "We made a commitment to do everything possible to bring resolution to this case for Deborah Kennedy and her family," he told the room. He called it one of the most important cases of his career. For 29 years, the family had lived without knowing who had done this to Deborah or why. The motive was still unknown, and Barron acknowledged it might stay that way. What the evidence locker could answer was the who, and 29 years stood between the night she gathered her evidence and the morning a detective pulled the file out of a drawer and decided to try again. A credit card on the bedroom floor of a house on Lee Baker Drive, and a fingerprint that sat on its plastic surface for 29 years, waiting for a machine that could read it. The woman who owned it had fought hard enough to mark her killer with her own hands. The mark held until somebody finally looked. If this case stayed with you, leave your thoughts in the comments. More solved cases in the playlist.